Good morning, everyone. My name is Janie Montblanc, and on behalf of the Great Basin Fire Science Exchange and our partners, I would like to welcome you to this webinar titled Sagebrush Conservation Strategy Part 1, presented by Tom Remington with the Western Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, and discussion afterward with Steve Hanser from the USGS and Pat Dibert from the Fish and Wildlife Service. Before I introduce our presenters, I'll go over some webinar details. We're using the Zoom meeting platform for this webinar so that we can have a live discussion at the end of the presentation if that's desired. So please keep yourself muted and your cameras off during the presentation, but feel free to turn them on for the discussion portion. That being said, this webinar is being recorded, so please keep that in mind. If you have technical questions, please type them into the chat anytime, and I or my co-coordinator, Corey Gooker, will address them. If you have questions about the presentation, you may also type them into the chat, but we'd like to address all the questions live after the presentation. So please try to refrain from responding to each other right away so that we can avoid side conversations. Now I'll introduce our presenters. Tom Remington is the Sagebrush Science Center Coordinator with the Western Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies. Steve Hanser is the Deputy Director for the USGS Fort Collins Science Center. And Pat Dibert is the Sagebrush Ecosystem Science Coordinator at the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And as I mentioned, Steve and Pat will be leading the discussion after the presentation. So welcome all, and thank you for being here today.
Okay, thanks, Jeannie. I'll try to share my screen here. Whoops. So I hoped I was ready. Here we go. Well, good morning, everyone. As Jeannie said, my name is Tom Remington. I'm the Sagebrush Science Coordinator for the Western Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies. Welcome to this. This day has been a long time coming to where we can introduce the Sagebrush Conservation Strategy, at least part one of it. I want to thank my co-presenters, silent co-presenters, if you will, Pat Dibert from the Fish and Wildlife Service and Steve Hanser from USGS, who not only helped me put this presentation together, but also served as primary editors and on the planning team, along with other representatives of most of the federal natural resource agencies and several of the state agencies that have been planning this effort since about 2016. So I want to give an overview of sort of what's in part one of the Sagebrush Conservation Strategy. That'll take about a half hour or so. Then we want to, as Jeannie indicated, we've got many of the primary authors from chapters within the part one that we want to introduce and make available to you. It's a lot of expertise, so take advantage of it. We can talk about the specific aspects of the report or more broadly sagebrush conservation. So the concept, the idea for a sagebrush conservation strategy evolved out of a collaboration between WAFWA, the Fish and Wildlife Service, and the BLM on Sagebrush Science Initiative and the Integrated Rangeland Fire Management Strategy. And importantly, we were developing this under the auspices of the Sagebrush Executive Oversight Committee, which WAFWA coordinates, but it's the leadership of all of the state and federal agencies involved in sagebrush or sage-grouse conservation initially. And so the contents of this, both part one and we'll talk about part two later, will get to decision makers and will be considered and potentially make a big difference. And I do need to acknowledge that this wouldn't have been possible. WAFWA may be coordinating this effort, but without the funding and technical support of BLM and the Fish and Wildlife Service and USGS, we wouldn't be here today. So thanks to those agencies for their support. So why did we undertake this effort back in 2016? We were coming off the really unprecedented collaborative conservation effort that led to the not warranted decision for sage-grouse. But I think all of us individually and collectively realized that it couldn't be about sage-grouse management forever. That it's a big biome with a lot of species and a lot of human dependencies, and managing for seasonal habitats for a single species probably wasn't going to get us there. But given that sage-grouse are a landscape scale species, and that there were unprecedented collaborative conservation efforts, there was a sense that maybe it's going to take us quite a ways, but we needed to identify what those gaps were, and where we needed to focus attention beyond sage-grouse. So you've seen various numbers that equate the importance of sagebrush biome to wildlife. Actually, Wisdom et al. In their eco-regional assessment of the Great Basin identified, I think it was 720 species that were associated with sagebrush at some point in their life cycles, 350 of which had some level of conservation concern, and 68 vertebrates. I think the Aldridge et al. Wyoming Basin eco-regional assessment bumped that to about 367 species. So you see a number of them, but the reality is there's a lot of species that are associated with sagebrush, quite a few that have dependencies, and some of them are sort of iconic Western species like pronghorn and mule deer and elk. Others are maybe less iconic, but very dependent on sagebrush, like sagebrush sparrows and pygmy rabbits and a few reptiles and amphibians. So clearly we need a focus beyond just seasonal habitats for sage-grouse. So our objectives going into this were several. One, there's still, I think, a lack of understanding about the degree to which this biome is under threat. And so we wanted to communicate the importance of the sagebrush biome, not only to dependent wildlife, but also to humans, discuss the threats to the biome, and discuss conservation opportunities and challenges. And there had been a lot of work done to bring together science relative to the sagebrush system. The DOI Integrated Rangeland Fire Management Strategy being one, and the Common Science Framework Parts 1 and 2 that came out of that. We wanted to update that effort and also to expand the emphasis, which was predominantly sage-grouse, expand that emphasis to other species and include human needs. And the idea was to create a roadmap to voluntary collaborative sagebrush conservation. We're really not addressing, other than maybe gaps and deficiencies in policy or regulation, but we're not addressing the regulatory side of the equation, but more guidance, science-based guidance. We're not developing a plan that commits resources. We're developing guidance that can lead the plans that will commit resources in the future, but addressing things like what do we need to do, where do we need to do it, how do we do it, and how much do we need to do it, answering those kinds of questions. And importantly, incorporate the human component of the sagebrush landscape. Been around long enough to realize that if you don't incorporate human needs into the equation on the front end, they get incorporated politically on the back end, and you're just not going to be successful if you don't recognize up front that humans do live on this landscape and have dependencies, and we need to address those while we're addressing wildlife and natural resource needs. And finally, we wanted this to be a resource for science related to sagebrush and sagebrush conservation. The lit cited, for instance, in this strategy runs, I don't know, hundreds of pages, and it really is in itself the most recent review, but there's also a lot of useful tables that we'll get into. So we wanted somewhat of a one-stop shop for science related to sagebrush and sagebrush conservation, so you didn't have to go running around to various sources to try and find out what lives there, or what their needs are, or how they're impacted. So we're giving an overview of part one, importance of the sagebrush biome to people and wildlife. We originally, to emphasize the importance, we wanted to start with human dimensions of sagebrush. Following the peer review, they recommended that we needed to introduce the biome a little better than we had. So we added a chapter A, an introductory chapter, but the first real content-based chapter is on human dimensions of sagebrush. And Drew Bennett and Julie Sewer-Pierce wrote that chapter, and they used a ecosystem service framework as sort of a backdrop to address human needs and benefits from the system. And they're many and diverse, including water purification, flood attenuation, water delivery to watersheds, carbon sequestration, intact healthy landscapes contribute to wildfire resistance. Obviously, there are benefits to production of grasses and grazing of livestock, which produce products for marketplaces. We derive a lot of recreational cultural benefits from sagebrush systems, whether we bike through them or hike through them or hunt within them or watch sage-grouse on lacs. And in addition, there's a strong sense of place and spiritual benefits that have been traditionally over thousands of years and continue to this day. So a lot of important human needs and benefits from the system that we need to keep front and center as we move forward. So chapters C through I of part one address the wildlife needs from the sagebrush system. And we have specific chapters on sagebrush birds, sage-grouse, pygmy rabbits, pronghorn, mule deer, small mammals, and reptiles and amphibians. And what we really look at is wildlife needs for species that are significant at a biome-wide scale. So there's obviously lots of species that are dependent on sagebrush at more regional scales, but that wasn't the intent here. Those come into part two, but which we'll talk about later. But anyway, we have individual chapters on those species and groups of species that discuss their distribution in relationship to the sagebrush extent. That bold dark line on the map just shows the outer boundary of where sagebrush occurs. It's truncated at the Canadian border because we're really only dealing with the US system in this document. Talks about that border was developed specifically for this strategy. So one of the contributions that came out of this collaborative effort. So distribution in relationship to the sagebrush extent, the habitat needs of the species, their relationship to sagebrush. You can see immediately on this sagebrush sparrow distribution map that their breeding is entirely within the sagebrush extent. They're true sagebrush obligates, although they do winter well to the south of the sagebrush extent. We look at population trends where, to the extent that information is known, we talk about threats to those species in a general sense. The specific summary of threats is in the threats chapters, or wildlife responses to threats is in the threats chapters. And we bring forward management considerations for those particular species or groups of species. Sort of examples, I guess, more than highlights of some new information or new presentation of information. This is Janet Racklow and Ian Smith's pygmy rabbit known distribution. The blue dots, buffered blue dots, are areas where pygmy rabbits are known to have been documented in the past, and they used information about those sites to project, model out where high quality pygmy habitat occurs, which frankly would be a tremendous place for sampling strata for looking for pygmy rabbits to try and document the true distribution of pygmy rabbits, and not just that which we are aware of. And the lighter gray shade is areas that have been modeled as suitable, but not necessarily high quality, and perhaps serving as connectivity corridors between these individual patches. But this kind of information has not been presented before, and I think it's well, we'll show later. I'll show some additional uses for this kind of information. So small mammals and reptiles and amphibians. I mean, we talk about mule deer and we talk about pronghorn a lot, particularly in state wildlife agencies, but we don't typically consider small mammals, reptiles, and amphibians when we're making management decisions or evaluating impacts of disturbances or proposals. So here in one place is information on about a dozen small mammals, where they occur within the sagebrush biome extent, what we know about their habitat use and habitat needs, and about their impact to disturbance, and also 60 amphibians and about 116 reptiles in the sagebrush ecosystem. So this kind of information, very useful when considering project impacts through NEPA or EISs, EAs, whatever, I think really useful to know where to even begin to look for which species might be potentially impacted. So part 2 of part 1 of the strategy, change agents in the sagebrush biome, their extent, their impacts, and current efforts to address them. We have individual chapters for each of the major threats to the system, including altered fire, invasive plants, climate change or adaptation, conifer expansion, free roaming equids, mining and energy, and land use and development. Some of the key aspects, some of these chapters. Altered fire regimes, chapter J, is really an excellent primer on the ecology of fire and sagebrush systems. And I've been at least peripherally involved in sagebrush conservation at some level, research or whatever, since 1980. And I thought I knew about the role of fire and sagebrush. I did not until I read this chapter. And I've read it about 100 times now. And it really is an excellent resource. In places we have way too much fire, obviously, in other places, we've taken fire out of the system, and both have very strong impacts on plant communities and on wildlife. So it talks about what role wildfire has played historically in sagebrush systems, talks about recent fire trends and patterns, and it's not as clear cut as one would think. And it's actually more difficult than one would think to document fire trends and patterns over time. But the chapter speaks to the impacts of altered fire regimes on the plant communities themselves, on wildlife, on ecosystem services. And then it talks about the suppression efforts, how to rehab burned landscapes, and the coordination that occurs both on suppression and rehabilitation. And really is an impressive system that's in place to address it. It's just, I think there's some capacity aspects that we need to address, but the system itself is, as described in this chapter, is really pretty good. So here's another application of that pygmy rabbit known occupied areas and high quality habitat areas. You can see if you overlay the geomag fire layer from 2000 to 2018, that somewhere between 13% of the known sites burned, 17% of the modeled high quality sites burned. So somewhere between 13 and 17% of pygmy rabbit habitat within the Great Basin has burned since 2000. And that's problematic given that the trend of fire is, as we'll see in a minute, is up. So a similar figure for sage-grouse. This one's a little more complicated, but the reddish color is the fires. The dark purple is priority habitat management areas, or blue, I guess, priority habitat management areas for sage-grouse. The lighter blue is sage-grouse distribution. And we can see that there's some fire impacting priority and general habitat for sage-grouse across the biome, but really impactful in the Great Basin. And in fact, in roughly the last 20 years, 21% of PHMAs for sage-grouse have burned in the Great Basin. And in the last 9 years, 7.6% of sage-grouse habitat has burned, which is about, this is at a biome scale or range-wide scale, about 1% per year, and that's accelerating. So significant problem, particularly in the Great Basin. And you can see fires, these figures are pulled right from the fire chapter. The number of hectares burned over time. This is all acre or hectares burned in the US, not just sagebrush or not just the West, but forest and sagebrush fires would be a huge component of that in the West. And you can see that trend is, I don't know that it's exponential, but it's up at a very steep rate. And the bottom figure in blue is the costs of suppressing those fires, never mind the restoration rehabilitation component, just the cost of suppression increasing dramatically to exceeding $500 million per year. So we do have a significant problem with fire in the sagebrush system. And that comes through in the chapter, and it expounds upon this as the primary explanatory relationship that invasive annual grasses like cheatgrass and medusa head and betonata are expanding, both in coverage and scope or extent, which is increasing the frequency, size, and intensity of fire, which destroys sage-grouse for, at the very least, a long period of time, and in some cases leading to a essentially permanent type conversion to an annual grassland state that then perpetuates itself as a climax community. And the problem is climate change is making it worse, not better. We'll talk about that again in climate adaptation chapter. So you can't talk about fire in the sagebrush system without talking about invasive plants, particularly invasive annual grasses. And this chapter is also a primer on invasive plants and sagebrush systems to the extent that distribution is known. That's spatial extent and distribution is talked about in the chapter. Talks about the feedback of invasive plants and climate, how climate impacts invasive plants, and how invasive plants impact plant communities, wildlife within those areas, and impacts on human communities. There is a lengthy analysis of policy and funding limitations relative to invasives, a discussion on successful partnership models such as cooperative weed management areas or associations in the West and where they're succeeding. Lengthy section on management for threat abatement, which includes prevention of invasive grasses or weeds in general, where early detection and rapid response is appropriate, and treatments and prioritization of areas for treatments. And also, it serves as a resource for information on invasive plants, as I'll show here in a minute. So this is we now have the ability to produce annually maps of invasive plant annual grass cover across the West, and you can see the Great Basin. You see the sagebrush extent in blue, and the Great Basin just coming across as high annual grass cover, but it's not restricted to the Great Basin at all. You can see the lower elevation portions of Utah, Wyoming, Montana, outside the Great Basin, have pretty high coverages of invasive annual grasses already, certainly high enough to increase the frequency and intensity of fire. And the reality is we don't have to wait anywhere in the sagebrush biome for invasive annual grasses to get there. They're already there. So some of the sources of information in that invasive plant chapter, table K1 gives where you can go to find further information on invasive plant species, their distribution and their management, describes the source of the information, who developed it, and what it contains. So pretty handy. A lot of those have links where you can directly link to those documents. There's a really useful appendix that kind of does that for you for the invasive plants that occur within sagebrush systems themselves. I just pulled the top 3 to show you as an example. For instance, medusa head, where there's still early detection and rapid response potential, where it's still not so prevalent that early detection and rapid response can really help. It talks about the habitat that it invades, and it talks about the negative impacts that that particular invasive plant contributes to the system or human or wildlife. So very useful summaries of information. So climate adaptation, really just a nice word for climate change. This chapter gives climate projections for the sagebrush biome, and bottom line, like everywhere else, it's going to get significantly warmer, particularly as one gets out towards the turn of the century. The chapter discusses what impacts those warming temperatures are likely to have on plant communities, on wildlife and people. There's actually pretty good agreement around those models that climates will be getting warmer. Less agreement, but good, I guess, good indication that precipitation is not going to change a lot, but the timing of precipitation may, which could be significant for a system that's reliant on winter storage of moisture. There's likely to be less snow and more coming as rain. But the bottom line is that climate change in the future will be a force multiplier for many of these threats. The droughts will be hotter, longer, and potentially more frequent, which will lead to more frequent and larger fires. Expansion of invasive annual grasses is likely to occur as those climate envelopes change, which will in itself contribute to more frequent and larger fires. Sagebrush stands are likely to become less resistant to invasive annual grasses and less resilient to disturbances. I guess the good news, if you will, is that sagebrush is likely to persist pretty much where it occurs today. There'll be some loss at the southern periphery and potential for some gain if we let it happen on the northern edge of the range. But the biomass of sagebrush is likely to decrease, which may have some implications for sagebrush dependent wildlife. But there's a good section on climate change adaptation strategies that can be employed, and also a discussion on climate as it relates to restoration. And again, as a resource, Appendix L1 provides a summary, a really useful summary of climate vulnerability assessments and adaptation strategies that are relevant to the sagebrush biome. Talks about the source itself, what year it was published, where it applies the geography, and the relevant targets that the adaptation strategies were directed at. So really good, again, primer on climate change and climate adaptation and sagebrush systems. So conifers have expanded tremendously over the past, I don't know, decade, century, whatever, into sagebrush systems, likely because of fire suppression at these higher elevation areas and potentially grazing, reducing fuel loads. But it does discuss that phenomenon and what causes it. Also describes the negative consequences of pinyon juniper invasion into sagebrush systems, changes the composition of plants within that plant community, reduces their productivity, water storage is declined, carbon storage goes down, resilience to fire goes down, and resistance to cheatgrass invasion goes down. So we tend to get cheatgrass invading under these pinyon juniper canopies after they invade sagebrush. And there's a good discussion about the need to consider conifer removal in the context of this ecological spectrum of woodland to shrubland continuum. We certainly don't want to be removing old growth pinyon juniper. Pinyon juniper are a key component of these systems in the right places. And it's not just old growth that's important to conifer obligates at some of these earlier seral stages as well. So we need to consider all of the species habitat requirements at a watershed scale to really get this right. And so good discussion on the need for that. It's also a discussion of conifer removal has been a strong focus of management agencies, particularly NRCS and the Sage-Grouse Initiative and Utah Watershed Restoration Initiative and others. A lot of effort in Oregon to address conifer invasion. Still, despite that, our best efforts to date, the analysis shows that we're basically removing it at a rate that's commensurate with its rate of expansion. So we're treading water. We're not cutting into the principal at all. We're just sort of paying the interest on that debt. And that's in 3 of the Western states where almost all that activity is occurring. So the other states are really behind the 8 ball in terms of conifer removal. So we have 3 other threat-based chapters: free roaming equids, mining and energy, and land use and development. I think you're getting the sense of sort of what's contained in these chapters. I'm not going to take the time to review each of these individually. They are a really useful summary of the sort of current status of these individual threats and where the impacts are occurring. You can see from these maps kind of where those impacts from those sources are occurring. But really good and useful summaries, but I just don't have the time to review them in depth here. So part 3 of part 1 of the Sagebrush Conservation Strategy is current conservation paradigm and other conservation needs for sagebrush. And I'll talk about each of these chapters specifically. So chapter Q, sage-grouse management as an umbrella for conservation of sagebrush and sagebrush obligates, was really to answer that question I brought up at the beginning about how far will our sage-grouse conservation efforts take us in addressing other sagebrush species needs and human needs. And it really is scale dependent at a sort of biome or scale, probably not that far in that primary construct for both regulatory protections for sage-grouse for priority habitat management areas shown in dark blue on this map. And they're also a primary construct for positive conservation actions that are being delivered, because those PHMAs were based on state core areas. So for sage-grouse, so both state and federal efforts tend to be focused on priority habitat management areas, or they may go by another name, core areas in Wyoming, et cetera. But those are the focus for both protective actions and for restoration activities or whatever conifer removal actions on the ground. And they comprise only about 1/3 of sage-grouse habitat and about 26% or 1/4 of areas that contain sagebrush. And the gray shading on, or tan, whatever that color is, shading on that map is the Colin Homer 5% or greater sagebrush cover layer. So it shows within that sagebrush extent where sagebrush occurs on the landscape. And there are some pretty big gaps where we don't have PHMAs for sage-grouse, and particularly if you get into New Mexico or Arizona where we don't have sagebrush, or Washington where we don't have PHMAs, you can see there's some pretty big gaps. So sage-grouse are not likely to be an effective umbrella in and of themselves, but that said, anything we do for sage-grouse at sort of a biome scale is going to benefit sagebrush dependent species writ large, but it really is scale dependent. When you zoom down into the local scale, the project scale, even if we had better coverage of PHMAs, the likelihood that a seasonal habitat for sage-grouse and protecting that is going to protect burrowing site for pygmy rabbits or a mule deer migration corridor. Basically, animals use habitats in very different ways, and the habitat requirements differ. So when we get down to that project scale, coverage is not likely to be particularly effective, and we're just going to have to consider the needs of these other species moving forward. We can't assume that sage-grouse are going to be a really effective proxy for that. And in fact, in some respects, it could be these setting aside or protecting PHMAs for sage-grouse could negatively impact other species, because if you move, oil pad or a wind farm or whatever it might be out of seasonally important breeding habitat for sage-grouse, you may very well pile it on top of a seasonally important habitat for pygmy rabbits or winter range for mule deer or migration corridor for pronghorn or whatever. So sometimes these, protecting one species may create problems for another. So restoration, Rick Miller and others in the SAB volume had a statement that nearly half the sagebrush in the Western US is now in a disturbed and degraded condition that is undesirable for wildlife, livestock, and other land uses, which suggests even independent of having to rehabilitate or restore burned areas or other disturbed areas, we have a lot of restoration work to do. And this chapter talks about restoration as a process, as a planning process, and it also provides insights for how you restore for wildlife conservation purposes, as opposed to just rehabilitating and preventing erosion and that sort of thing, how those differ. Talks about how to prioritize restoration at both landscape and project scales, which I think is really valuable, because we clearly are going to have to prioritize, and that the need is so much greater than our capacity. It carries forward the resistance and resilience concepts from the common science framework and speaks to those. And you can see that lower figure, the areas depicted in red. These are sage-grouse management zones, but the areas depicted in red are very low resilience. The tannish color is moderate resistance. And you can see that much of the sagebrush biome at this scale anyway, depicted as low or moderate resistance and resilience. So we really need to keep that in mind as we're doing restoration or applying other conservation strategies. Talks about the impacts of weather and grazing on restoration success, and both are critical. It gives sources of weather information that can enhance probability of success, and talks about when and how to apply herbicides to control invasive annual grasses, and when and how to seed within sagebrush systems, and how one can be successful at seeding. A lot of sort of key aspects of that chapter, in that the primary objective of restoration is to maintain or increase desirable perennials such as sagebrush and forbs, and perennial grasses that can provide resistance to invasion and resilience to future disturbance, and that also are key to wildlife habitat needs. A lot of challenges to that in the system as arid as the sagebrush. Many cases we don't have basic site information. It'd be wonderful if we had really accurate state and transition models to inform our efforts, but we don't. And there are lots of logistical challenges to treatment application, including when trying to restore a 120,000 acre burn, there's a lot of logistical impediments to doing something at that scale, including seed availability, and et cetera. The movement in restoration, it talks about the emphasis is now on prioritizing areas that need intervention and are likely to have a positive response. We've always prioritized areas that needed intervention for obvious reasons, but sometimes we spent a lot of money on places where we were not likely to be successful, and we understand that a whole lot better now. And the chapter talks about that. How to prioritize sites given probability of success, and how to incorporate adaptive management approaches. And a key point that's made is the one and done approach, where we go in following fire or following disturbance, and we when it's your turn, you do what you can and move on, is not likely to be successful. It hasn't been successful in the past. And so we need to involve multiple stakeholders that have multiple pots of money that can sustain a restoration effort over the several to many years that it's going to take to achieve success. So adaptive management and monitoring applies to restoration at local scales. It applies to the biome as a whole at biome scales and at mid scales. We absolutely have to incorporate an adaptive management and monitoring approach. This chapter talks about the sort of theory and practice, the technique of adaptive management and monitoring. Emphasizes the sequential cycle of learning and adaptation. Talks about how, because we talk about adaptive management and monitoring a lot in natural resource management. We think we're doing it in some cases. The chapter talks about adaptive management light, which are all of these sort of efforts that move in that direction, but don't include a true adaptation of management in response to monitoring. But we do have some good examples where state and federal agencies and NGOs are collaborating. The chapter talks about the waterfowl management through the flyway and modeling efforts that Fish and Wildlife Service completes, the monitoring that is conducted in the US and Canada, and truly is an adaptive management and monitoring construct. What's lacking, however, in that one is a tie to habitat. So the only output of that is reduction in hunting opportunity if populations decline, as opposed to some sort of emphasis on habitat restoration if populations decline. But we have other models within individual states, so they show examples that are, I guess, less intimidating It talks about that there are many efforts that are currently ongoing, particularly on the monitoring side, that could support an adaptive management effort. The AIM monitoring, habitat monitoring, the HAF for Sage-Grouse, the hierarchical cluster analysis on Sage-Grouse based on state luck counts, integrated monitoring for bird conservation being conducted across the West. Anyway, they talk about all these sources of information that could be aggregated in a meaningful adaptive management and monitoring effort for sagebrush. So the final chapter is on communication and public engagement. And this chapter talks about the need for communication and public engagement in sagebrush, the fact that sagebrush has a huge branding problem. National forests have Smokey the Bear, and we know it's important to prevent forest fires because Smokey the Bear has been telling us for, I don't even know how long, 50 years or more, I think. We don't have an equivalent brand for sagebrush, and they talk about sagebrush being the Rodney Dangerfield of biomes. It gets no respect. It tends to be flyover country. We don't necessarily appreciate the benefits or the threats to it. And that isn't going to change unless we develop an effective communication method and capacity. They discuss the current capacity for communication. We have made tremendous strides in that. The Sage West Listserv, the Sage West effort in communication. They've hosted media, they've produced videos. So we're making progress, but we're not there yet in terms of communication and public engagement. And we're not going to get additional resources to the scale that additional resources are needed unless we convince Congress. And Congress gets convinced when people are aware and informed and lobby. So a really important piece of this overall puzzle. They emphasize how communication needs to be parallel and congruent with conservation efforts. We need to engage the public. We need to keep them informed, and that needs to occur early in any sort of conservation activity process. So that's part one, which was conservation challenges. Part two of the sagebrush conservation strategy is currently under development, and it's the actual strategies for sagebrush conservation themselves. We have been working on that. We still have a fair bit to do, but we hope to get that published later this year. So at the biome scale wildlife needs were summarized in part one. Since all conservation is local, we'll summarize human and wildlife conservation needs at more ecoregional scales in part two. We'll do that more briefly through tables that are predominantly extracted from state wildlife action plans about their species of conservation concern that transect sagebrush. In a section on increasing capacity for conservation, we'll review models of collaborative conservation that are successfully addressing threats across the West, and there are many of them. I fervently believe that the models that will get us through this are out there. We need to figure out a way to replicate them and increase their capacity, but the models are out there. So last summer, we developed non-regulatory strategies through a stakeholder engagement process that probably many of you on this call participated in, to help address these individual threats or in aggregate. That's done. What remains to be done is to embed them in some sort of an ecological context that sort of makes sense in a prioritization scheme. And I think about the Idaho cheatgrass challenge and the approach that they took, which was to protect the core as job one, job two, expand the core and connect the core. And then that sort of leaves the rest and what strategies you bring forward to deal with the rest. Probably use some sort of something similar to that. We'll have work groups that are sort of looking at how do you define a core. Right now we have a core built on sage-grouse seasonal habitat needs. The core that we're going to talk about needs to consider all a systems approach, a biome approach, and that considers all the wildlife and human dependencies. So we'll have a work group that's looking at that, and then that's that conservation design aspect. Where do we need to work, and what strategies do we need to employ in those locations? We have another group right now working on network governance. Patrick Bixler and his social science report on the Sagebrush biome that was funded through the Sagebrush Science Initiative identified 509 entities that were engaged in sagebrush conservation across the West. There are many others that are engaged in sagebrush conservation, but are not necessarily aware that they're doing that. We need to find a way to stitch those efforts together so that the sum of those individual contributions amounts to a collective whole that solves the problem. And so we have a contract with the Udall Institute and the Network for or Center for Resolution, excuse me, that's working with an advisory group and a core group to develop those recommendations for how we can better stitch together those sort of what are often disparate efforts right now. So that's what part 2 is going to contain. Like I said, we hope to get that out later this year. It will also be a USGS report that's peer reviewed and peer reviewed science. So I need to conclude. Here's the link to the document itself, the citation. And I need to recognize there were 94 authors and representing over 30 agencies and organizations that contributed to this document. We truly had the best scientists and specialists on sagebrush in the West working on this, and could not have been completed. And it wouldn't be as valuable a contribution without the support of those individuals and those partner agencies. So thank you for that. Stop screen sharing. I want to turn it over to Steve Hanser from US. It's locking me out.
So Tom, do you want me to just go ahead and move us forward here?
If you, please,
okay.
Please do, Steve. It won't let me out.
All right. So I guess just Tom mentioned we had 94 authors contribute to the document, and just from my count, it looks like we have about 16 folks from that authorship list. So I just want to list those names out here so that we know who all we have available to answer questions today. Just going to go in alphabetical order here. So we have Adrian Monroe, Beth Newingham, Cam Aldridge, Doug Scheneman, Drew Bennett, Matt Germino, Heather McFerrin, Jason Tack, John Dinkins, Lindy Garner, Leith Wickman, Matt Holleran, Pat Divert, Steve Boyd, Susanna Swallow, Tom, who you just heard from, and Nicole DeCrepio, and myself. And so we are going to just take the rest of the time we have here today, and we want to answer any questions, have a conversation with you all. If you want to raise your hand in the participant section of the chat, or in the participant window, or if you want to just type a question in, we can take those as they come in, and then we can start a conversation. Here we have about, looks like we have about 40 minutes left. So I'm going to just first off go with the question here in the chat. It looks like Janie asked the question here. Does the discussion, or actually I'm going to ask you, Janie, let's get us going on a conversation. Do you want to ask your question?
Well, actually, it wasn't my question. I was posting it to someone. I think I scared everyone off from asking questions in the chat with my "please don't have side conversations." So someone just wrote that question just to me only. So I reposted it to everyone.
Okay. Well, I will go ahead and I can read it off myself.
Okay.
If somebody else wants to follow up, if they had this question, that would be great. But the question was, does the discussion in maps of acres burned consider how many acres are reburns versus removal of extant sagebrush cover? is fire severity discussed? And I'm going to just call on Doug Shinneman because I know he's an author and on the altered fire regime chapter. Doug, are you still on the call?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, so there's I think a few maps that show the fire history and the area burned, and those would include all fires. So that includes areas that have burned and then subsequently reburned. That's not necessarily evident in those maps because the coloration of the maps may not, I think in all cases, don't necessarily show that history, the areas that have burned multiple times. It doesn't include removal of sagebrush cover though. Maybe somewhere in this massive document, there's something that refers to that, but at least in the fire chapter, those maps, essentially just portray the fire history, the fire perimeters.
Great, thanks, Doug.
Yeah, if I could follow up, Steve. So the specific figures that I showed in my presentation on pygmy rabbits and sage-grouse, Justin Welty and I put those together, and we didn't try to tease out burn versus reburn. So to some extent, they probably overstate the amount of habitat burned, but I don't think it's by a huge amount because it was relatively recent period that we were looking at, last 9 years and last 19 years. So I don't think it's a huge overstatement, but there probably is a little bit of an overstatement there.
Thanks, Tom. So next question. Anybody have any comments or questions to add? You can either put those in the chat or just unmute and ask your question of the group.
While we're waiting for other questions, can I ask about the second, the part 2? That's going to be the intent with that one, once that comes out, is to actually do a webinar series on each of the chapters so people can dive in deeper to this information. Is that correct? And maybe do like fact sheets on each one of those to make those chapters more accessible. Am I recalling that correctly?
I believe that makes sense to me, Janie. I guess Tom, I know you've been leading the charge on that. Do you want to provide an update on what the products beyond the report itself may be?
Yeah, I think that would be marvelous. I'm more focused on getting it done, and then worrying about what we do with it when it's done is a problem for another day. We actually started this thing. I had black hair, and we actually met in person and didn't have to wear masks. So that's how long we've been at this thing. So I'll be looking forward to getting those strategies in the hands of decision makers. But I think what you suggest, I think it's been in the back of our mind. We just haven't sat down and committed to it yet.
Great, thanks.
I guess I'll just add, I think the intent would be to have another webinar, at least another webinar to help introduce the content similar to this, so the community can have a chance to come in and ask questions and engage with the authorship group. Yes.
Question. First, I want to start with a comment that I was able to take a quick read through the report, and I was really impressed that you included the human dimensions and people going back thousands of years and the science communication, and it all kind of was packaged together and more integrated. So I think that's really great. Kind of seeing where we've come with strategies that are part of a science plan. Is actually the outreach and communication. So that was really cool. I'm with the National Park Service at Grand Teton, and we have a third of our park is sagebrush. So really excited about this this report, kind of putting things together For me, I'm a relative newcomer to sagebrush management. So kind of my question is kind of simple, is I wasn't on this mailing list, but someone forwarded me the invite and information. So just what mailing list and like what places where can I go to be really informed of what's happening and how this develops?
So I guess there are a couple of different places where, and the communications chapter, as Tom alluded to at the end, is talking about how can we improve our communication strategy in Sagebrush. I know one of the primary conduits that this was sent out was via the Sage West Listserv. It provides a place for those folks that are interested in Sagebrush communications to get information and share information. I know Susanna Swallow, I think you're on here, and you're well connected within the Sagebrush communication group. Do you have any information you want to share on upcoming strategies, other than the Partners in the Sage link that she just put into the chat? So that's another place where they aggregate a lot of the communications pieces there as well.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. You can subscribe to the listserv, and I'll try to find that link. And that goes out to a large distribution of folks, and you will find announcements from new science to workshops to different types of trainings. And so we use Sage West to promote this webinar here. USGS also has newsletters and other mechanisms for getting the word out, and I'm sure the other organizations do as well.
That answer your question, Laura? Yeah.
Yes, thank you.
All right. Other questions or comments?
Hi, this is Gillian Wigglesworth, and I just had a question. Oops, let me take that off. I just had a question about how these two sagebrush conservation strategies sort of overlap with the science frameworks that have come out. And if you could just provide just a little bit of connection there.
You want me to take that one, Tom, or do you want to? I guess
Well, go ahead. I'll fill in.
Okay. So basically, the science framework was the basis that we started from for development of Part 1, and we tried to make sure that this was a complementary document to the content there. And this is largely an update and expansion of the information that's in there. You notice a lot of the R&R framework and the concepts in the science framework Part 1 and 2 are repeated within this document, and we add in these other species, other concepts. So it's meant to build upon that content that was in the framework.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I figured that there was quite a bit of overlap, but that's a good explanation. Appreciate it.
Okay. Yeah, and the majority of those 94 authors in some way integrated with were part of that the work that went into part 1 and part 2. So we were in communication with the authorship group from that document as we were developing this. Anya Tyson, it looks like you have a question here. Happy to repeat, or do you want to ask your question or make a comment?
Hi, yeah, I'd just be reading aloud what I put in the chat, which was, Tom, it was a good hook that you put out there that you said, I thought I knew everything there was to know about fire ecology and the sagebrush biome. But then I read this chapter and it taught me a thing or two. And I was curious if you wanted to elaborate a little bit. I mean, you already piqued my interest. I'm going to go read the chapter, but I was wondering what threw you for a loop when you read it.
Yeah, good question. So I was sort of coming into this being an old sage-grouse guy from Jack Connolly's perspective, where fire is horrible. We should never burn in the sagebrush system. It was never part of, it occurred at such a low frequency that it was essentially irrelevant. And what I learned from the chapter is that no, fire has been a part of sagebrush community ecology and its evolution. to varying degrees. And in fact, we don't understand it nearly as well as I would have thought, because we don't have burn scars from old sagebrush. It doesn't persist. You actually only have good fire histories where you're adjacent to forested habitats, which by definition tend to be high elevation. So we have good fire histories at high elevation, but we really don't understand fire as well at lower elevations. But this idea that, too much fire I got, the whole fire invasive annual grass cycle I got, but I didn't get that conifer expansion was predominantly because of fire suppression activities and reduction of fuel loads at higher elevations. For instance, so fire is a much more dynamic component of sagebrush systems than I recognized in general. Both, it occurs at, there is no one prevalence. It's very much a component of the local characteristics. I think those were the things that were most struck me the most, I guess, out of that.
Okay, I am in the process of reading multiple chats coming in here from multiple sources. It appears, let's see who has, we have the, if you're interested in joining the listserv for Sage West, as we were discussing before, please contact Dolly Edmonds at Audubon. She helps manage that listserv for the group. I guess we were just talking about the value and the information that's in this document. And I think one thing I'll just point out, and it was clear there, that this is a broad overview of all things sagebrush. It provides a nice science foundation and information resource for managers across the West. So, not only within the fire chapter, but the information in the invasive species chapter is quite extensive. The information in the climate adaptation chapter, which is a heavy news item of late. It provides sort of that science foundation for whatever that next decision may be needed within the ecosystem. So just for those that have not picked up this resource, I highly recommend taking a look at the content, because there's probably something in there that you have not seen before from a scientific perspective. Okay, well, we still have some time here.
Steve, Karen has her hand up.
Oh, I didn't see that. Okay.
Karen, Prentice.
Yeah, Karen.
Hey.
It's just a very tiny blue hand there, Karen. Sorry, I missed it.
All right, I'll try to be bigger next time.
Okay.
My question really segues off of what you just said, Steve, and that's a debate that we have with a lot of our managers within BLM, and that is, does a document like this have value to folks who are planning individual projects or treatments on the ground? So is it worth picking up if a person just works within a specific district or field office? Thanks.
So I guess I'll start, and then we can pitch this around to several authors, because that may have some comments on that. But I think the overview information, the species information can provide some context for the decisions that need to be made across the landscape at whatever scale you're working at. There's also extensive information on approaches to restoration and adaptive management and monitoring. Again, whatever scale it is that you're working across the landscape, those principles still can apply. I can just say from the restoration chapter, it follows largely a construct that's used to teach a course for BLM managers on the planning and approach for restoration. So there's a little bit of something here for everyone, no matter what scale, large or small, that you're approaching sagebrush conservation from. Pat.
And this is Kat. Yeah, I'll weigh in a little bit more there. I think it has a lot of valuable resources. So maybe it may not give you specific information for your location, but it's going to give you information about, as Steve said, the overview of the issue and the concern, but also links to resources that might be very applicable to local conservation efforts. And so I think it provides an excellent volume, nothing else, at least a reference volume for you to go to and find that information for your specific project.
And Lindy, I see you've joined us here.
I popped up. I'll just mention in the invasive chapter, I would highly recommend for folks that are thinking about planning projects on the ground, because we do talk about prioritization, things that you need to consider when you're trying to prioritize which projects to do on the ground and how you can evaluate those trade-offs, as well as especially some of the discussion on thresholds, thinking about, when do I need to look at invasions relative to a management trigger? What type of threshold should I be thinking about relative to monitoring for management effectiveness? It's not going to give you the specific triggers for your site, but it's going to give you that kind of, like Pat was saying, the background information to think about that. And other important concepts to think about as well that most invasive weed managers know, but again, it's just a good reminder. It's a good primer on things like weedy succession or the invasion treadmill. Dealing with additional species coming in after you've managed for another one. And then just that cooperation piece, which kind of goes along with the prioritization of working to try to get your partners on the same page for objectives and how you define success. And all of those pieces, though they are broad, from the broad perspective, they're extremely important for those pieces that are on the ground for project planning and for identifying whether those projects are successful.
Great, thanks.
Yeah, the only thing I'd add is I think there's information in here that would help you at a project level in multiple ways. One under the first do no harm aspect. Are there invasive weeds present, and are they at a, like Lindy said, are they at a threshold where they're likely to take over the site if you disturb it? If it's conifers, or pinyon jay is a factor here, or a consideration. So both on that side of it, but also on the improving your probability of success. First of all, is it even a good place to invest resources? Do you have a reasonable probability of success? And the restoration chapter will give you a sense of that. The climate adaptation chapter talks about sources of information on weather, so you know whether it's even appropriate season to be seeding, or whether you're facing like we are right now in the Four Corners region, unprecedented drought, probably a bad place to make an investment in seeding this year. But the communications chapter is going to tell you right off, involve, well, the restoration chapter says involve a bunch of people so that you can sustain the effort. The communication chapter will talk about the need to communicate what you're doing to audiences so that you don't get opposition, depending on, controlled burn or what it might be. But I think there are take-home messages, even though this is a sort of broad spectrum contextual analysis, if you will. I think there are very useful pieces of information and some context that will help at a project scale.
All right, and I guess I'll open it up to other chapter authors if you have information you want to share based on the content. This is a good time to join the conversation. Or if you have other questions or comments, feel free to raise your hand. I now know to look for this tiny blue hand in the corner of my screen here, or type something in the chat. Okay. Appears as though we have answered the questions.
So I have one for you, Steve. Is the Sage-Grouse document going to come out today?
It is scheduled for release at noon today, and there will be there's a press release to come out with that as well. So and And the Sage-Grouse report that Tom is referring to is the Hierarchical Sage-Grouse Population Monitoring Framework that we've been working on with state and state agencies for a number of years now. And I guess I just saw that there's a comment from Leif Wickman. Leif, do you want to provide an update? You're more in the center of this.
Sure, thanks, Steve. Yeah, I'll just expand a little bit. We have a open file report coming out on greater sage-grouse population trends and a targeted annual warning system. And so that is a report that is the culmination of over 5 years of collaboration with state and federal agencies. And so we are poised to have that released at noon today. There'll be a press release from USGS and proofing pages this morning. So we're fingers crossed, we're good to go.
And I'll just preview that there is going to be a webinar related to that document on April 1st, so on Thursday.
And I can post that information in the chat here.
Thanks, Tom, for the opportunity to pitch another product.
I thought that might trigger some questions.
Leif, we put the link in the chat for you. We thought it might come up.
Hey, thanks.
Thanks, Drew. Appreciate it. Just some kudos in the chat there. But yeah, again, I just want to say thank you to all the authors that are on here. I know those of us that have been on the editorial team, we've been working for many months to get the final document out, and the work that went into developing the content of those chapters couldn't have been done without the 94 individuals that helped develop the content. So it looks like we're petering out here, Tom and Janie. I think we can continue the conversation in the chat, or feel free to ask any questions to Tom. Send any information to Pat or I, and we'll be happy to continue to answer any questions about the content that you guys might have. And I'm not sure, Tom or Janie, do you have any closing words for us as we finish up here?
I'd like to thank everybody for participating. There will be a limited supply of printed versions of this eventually. We even haven't had a chance to talk about how many we can afford, but we do intend to publish a limited number. Each of the authors will certainly get one, but we'll have some for agencies. So if you have a specific need for a printed version, email one of us and we'll see what we can do when that day comes.
Yeah, you know what, I might even I'm going to put my email address in the chat so people can email me if they have requests too, because that's something that in the past we've been able to support. So if there is a big desire for, if people really want hard copies, we can most likely support that. So I'll do that right now. Sorry to be typing while I'm on.
And the other thing I'll mention, while we still got a few people, we are going to be forming a few work groups to complete part 2 of the strategy. And we do have the list of those who volunteered at our stakeholder engagement meeting last summer. But if you aren't on that list and have a specific expertise and perspective to contribute, we'd love to have you. So send an email to one of the 3 of us or Jeannie, and we'll get you plugged in.
Great, thanks. And I just want to also let everyone know that the recording of this webinar will be posted on the Intermountain West Joint Venture website. We could put a link to that in the chat as well, but most of you probably saw the email announcement. They came through Sage West. Hannah Nickenow is with Intermountain West Joint Venture. She sent that. And then also Great Basin Fire Science Exchange. And it will be posted on our Great Basin Fire Science Exchange YouTube channel. And so we'll get that link out to you when it's posted. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks for hosting this, Jeannie, and your help with this.
Yeah, our pleasure. Well, you want me to shut down?
I guess.
Okay. All right. Thanks again, everyone. And thank you so
Yep,
much,
thank
Tom
you.
and Pat and Steve.
See you, Pat.